This is Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing. I'm Rachel Gordon. Here we aim to make the process of writing and publishing a bit more transparent and a bit less overwhelming. Through conversations with editors and academics at all stages, from full professors to graduate students, independent scholars, and postdocs, we share stories, lessons, and helpful habits from our writing lives. We're really excited to get to speak with Andy Horowitz, who is an associate professor of history and also serves as the Connecticut State Historian. Broadly, Andy's work is meant to help people think through problems that are often imagined to be without precedent. A scholar of the modern United States, his research focuses on disasters and the questions they give rise to about race, class, community, trauma, inequality, the welfare state, and environmental change. Andy's first book, Katrina, A History, 1915 to 2015, won a 2021 Bancroft Prize in American History and was named the 2021 Humanities Book of the Year by the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities and a 2020 Best Nonfiction Book of the Year by Publishers Weekly. So, Andy, it's great to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me.
First of all, I have to ask, what does it mean to be a state historian, and how did this come about for you?
I ask myself that question every morning. What does this mean? It's funny, you would think I'd have a good answer to that because I've had this job now for around 3 years, but historians are just kind of haunted by the question of origins. Causation is all we've got, so where you start the story becomes a really fraught thing, and so it becomes very hard for me to even answer this question. Should I start with the creation of the position of Connecticut State Historian in 1935? Should I tell you about, that I was born in Connecticut, or that my grandmothers were the first important storytellers in my life? I could kind of start anywhere, and all those things, are relevant. But it's important not to get too crazy here. So I guess just to say that the position is appointed. I'm a member of the UConn, University of Connecticut History Department, and the position for many years has been appointed by the UConn History Department. So I serve as just a regular faculty member, and then I have this sort of other half of my life that, on the one hand, involves a lot of work on public boards and commissions. By state statute or by tradition, serve on a number of public boards and commissions. And also, I just fashioned myself and am meant to be kind of a hype man for history and the humanities, and I try to do that in all kinds of ways.
So when you were hired at your current university, did they tell you, state historian is likely to happen, or this is part of the position, or how did that come about?
It was very much part of the hiring process and the lead and really the lead part of what they were advertising. And I think what I was hired to do is very exciting to me. I have a peculiar set of skills, and the opportunity to do public service in this way struck me as kind of the most interesting thing I could do with the funny skills I had. So I had been at Tulane University in New Orleans for most of a decade, and I was really proud of the work I did there and really happy to be in New Orleans. I wrote about New Orleans, as you mentioned. But I had grown up in Connecticut and I had some experience doing history work in my hometown of New Haven. And so the chance to come back on these terms was just really exciting to me.
Listeners might be wondering, is state historian something that might be available as a position in other states, or do you know whether that's out there beyond Connecticut?
My expertise ends at the state line, so I can't I can't speak for all of it. No, but not every state has a state historian. In fact, last time I checked, I think it's only around 7 or 8 states have this position. It's structured really differently in different places. Some people might be associated with a historical society or a library, or might be in a kind of state department of culture, recreation, and tourism, that kind of place. So it is rare. And I want to say, I think really kind of enlightened for Connecticut to have someone who is a research scholar and is involved doing, serious research scholarship, training undergraduates and graduate students and associated with the university. And to think that that is the right orientation for the person to serve as state historian, I think is maybe unique in the country. And it's just a fabulous job on those terms.
Yeah. You've been writing about disasters and about places. Why has this been your direction, and did you know that going into grad school?
Those have been my two focuses, and it's funny, I didn't think of them as going together, really, disasters and places. I've always been, I grew up, I think, interested in the places that were closest to me, whether it was, my grandmother's telling me stories about my family, or as I grew up in New Haven, and then I grew up in New Haven and then I went to Yale. And a funny thing that happens when you go to Yale from New Haven is that the one thing that you have in common with everyone you go to school with up until then, which is that everybody else is from New Haven, suddenly switches. And I was one of only 5 people, I think, in my class at Yale from New Haven. And so all of a sudden I had this expertise I didn't know I had, which is that I knew my way around. And I found myself just being asked, first of all, people asked insane questions like, is there, where can I get a pizza in New Haven? It's like, oh, funny you should ask. We have the best. Mm-hmm. But also just being thrown into the role of tour guide and realizing I didn't have answers to a lot of questions that people would ask me. And I also had this funny job in high school and then in college also over the summers working for the New Haven Department of Weights and Measures. And so stay with me here. I had a city car and a weight kit and a badge. And my job was to go around to anywhere in the city that sold products by weight. It's like a little deli where you might want to buy a quarter pound of cheese or something, and make sure that the scales were calibrated correctly so that, you wouldn't pay for a third of a pound, but only get a quarter of a pound. And anyway, what this meant was that for every summer, 3 years in a row, I went into every small store in every neighborhood in the city. And these stores are often, neighborhood institutions or ethnic outposts. They're places where people are speaking all kinds of different languages or preparing for all different kinds of holidays that I might not have been aware of, with the specialty things that would come out seasonally or whatever. And so it just kind of opened up New Haven to me as kind of being the whole world. That sounds like a very parochial thing to say, but it was just incredibly diverse and fascinating to me. So all these things kind of swirling around me when I was becoming an adult, where I was meant to be this New Haven expert, had to show around all my new classmates and friends, to show them around the city, a city that was opening up to me because of this job that I had that was bringing me, to every corner of the city. And it just made place, I think it taught me as I was coming into consciousness as a grown-up, that the more you learned about a place, the more interesting it got. I think sometimes that can be counterintuitive for people. You think, the more you learn at a certain point, you hit a wall and get boring or bored. But my experience was just the opposite. Just the more I learned, the more it seemed like there was to know. Here's a new immigrants from a country I didn't know much about. Why? What made them come to Connecticut and why? And then you have to learn the history of that country. And so in all those ways, place just kind of appealed to me. And then as I went to graduate school, I sort of came to understand that I wasn't going to be a subfield historian. Many of my classmates and many of my important teachers, were interested in environmental history or urban history or Southern history or African American, or, any of these very vibrant intellectual traditions. And I learned and read deeply in as many of those as I could. But as I thought about research questions and as I wrote, I kind of wanted to put them all together. And I think place gave me a way to do that. And place was the way that I understood how these things came together, because it's just kind of how I understood my own life. Who am I? I'm from New Haven. I can tell you that. That makes sense to me. Anyway, I think that's part of how I came to place. Disasters is a different story, but I'll pause here and see if you want to talk more about place or talk about disasters.
I kind of imagine both maybe allow for a different kind of writing or storytelling. I mean, the disaster, just the drama part, but the place, even when I'm writing history, I almost feel like some of that kind of our town, Thornton Wilder feel of like, if I can set the stage and get some of the feel from that era, it's exciting to write that way, I find. I'm curious how you think it affects your writing.
The thing that attracted is the wrong word. We'll talk about that with the therapist later. The thing that is interesting to me about writing about disasters as a historian is that people often, almost by definition, think of disasters as events that come out of nowhere. They are, pure contingency, lightning strikes, acute episodes, unprecedented is, I haven't done the scientific study, but I think unprecedented is probably the adjective most associated with events that we name disasters. And unprecedented, the notion that something's unprecedented or ahistorical is, any historian is just automatically allergic to that concept. And so they just seemed really ripe to me. And in fact, many, in the tradition of disaster studies, many scholars from other humanities and social science disciplines that have been drawn to disasters had been drawn to them explicitly because they seem to be events without histories. They seem to reveal uniquely human responses. These were moments when culture didn't matter and human nature just came to the fore. And historians just, again, just are complete. That's just totally anathema to the way we think about the world. So they seemed like really teed up for historians to ask questions about and to learn about. And it's been a great or productive process for me to take events that seem to be without precedent or without history and try to give them a history, to try to discover what the precedents were. And when I write about Katrina, I say, you can't start when the levees broke, as many stories about Katrina do, because somebody had to build the levees before they could break. And in so many ways, that's been a kind of analyzing conceit for my work on disasters. I haven't been drawn so much, honestly, to the drama. You said, you're drawn to the drama. I struggle as a writer to write those moments, I think, but also as you get really down to the really scary moments, those do seem closer to me like contingency. Does the tree fall one way or another? Does the water come at what speed? At that moment, those are like the few fleeting seconds that maybe are kind of outside of human control, and therefore are not the ones as a historian that I'm most drawn to. I'm most drawn to the causes and consequences, the decisions and social arrangements, made before and after that do seem to shape people's fates.
I heard you recently when you were interviewed on National Public Radio as part of their Decade After Katrina discussion. And it made me wonder if you realized at some point in researching or writing this, that it would be this kind of big deal history, part of a national conversation. When did that awareness come for you?
I remember at the beginning of graduate school, a very important teacher of mine named Gwenda Gilmore. I think also, everybody who does what we do has teachers that reshape their lives and whose words live in their head all the time. And for me, one of those people is this professor named Gwenda Gilmore. And she said, how many books are you going to write in your life? You should make sure they matter to you. And so Katrina mattered to me in a couple of ways. I'll say briefly, one is that in graduate school, my then girlfriend and now wife was from Louisiana. And I really wanted to learn about where she was from. So I knew I wanted to write about Louisiana. This was going to be my, heroically nerdy way of getting closer to her. Not about Katrina specifically, but to learn about Louisiana. And Katrina came into focus somewhat later. But I remember calling her. We knew each other in 2005 when the levees broke. And I remember calling her just to kind of give some comfort, really. I wanted to say things were going to be all right. And when she'd been living at the time in Lafayette, Louisiana, which is like 2 hours west of New Orleans. And when I called her, there were people crying, I heard in the background, because friends of hers had evacuated from New Orleans to Lafayette, and they were watching their neighborhoods flood on TV. And I remember saying to her, tomorrow you will see the most powerful country in the history of the world do something unequivocally good. And that was my belief. And then, of course, the next day, there was no rescue effort. There was no response, and more people drowned in their attics. And the same was true the second day, and the same was true the third day. And so, I was kind of left to wonder, how could I be so wrong about my own country? So that really animated Katrina became really important to me. So Louisiana was important to me personally, and then Katrina became important to me politically and intellectually as something to figure out. And so, it wasn't that I was certainly not trying to write an important book for the world. I was trying to write an important book for myself. But I do think, and I tell my students, I talk about this with my students a lot, that our work is supposed to be always answering that so what question. And so Katrina steals from the headlines a little bit. And when it's something like the 20th anniversary, sometimes the media comes calling. But a good book will make the case that it's worth reading and worth knowing about. And so I aspired to write a book that would matter to me. And I aspired to write it in a way that if someone found their way to it, they might think it was worth reading every page.
Have you found your next so what? I don't remember reading what the next or the current project is for you.
I'm working on a couple of different projects right now. There are lots of different ways you can divide up the field of historians. I will answer that dreaded question of what are you working on now in a minute. But just by way of preamble, there's a lot of ways of dividing up historians, who we are and what we do. Some people are so admirably make that empathetic leap into other times and places, that they are kind of aloof from current events. The goal is really to achieve a kind of metaphysics and see how people try to see the world through somebody else's eyes in a place that's very different from our own. And that's beautiful. It's a beautiful way to do the work. And I don't do that at all. I'm a resolutely presentist and proudly presentist historian, where I'm very aware of looking through my own eyes at the past and trying to figure out questions about the present, by using the past as the genre demand to write about the present. And so the past couple of years have been so crazy making. Not just that I had kids and I moved across the country and I got a new job. I moved from Louisiana to Connecticut, which is a very different set of circumstances. And our politics have just obviously been, there's been a lot of changes going on. And so my sense of what it would be important for me to write has been pushed and pulled in a couple of different directions. The thing that I am working on earnestly, though, right now is, again, on that question of precedents. Climate is writing a book about climate change, or writing a book about the United States in light of climate change. There are a number of moments, or a number of policy prescriptions or challenges that we face today that are described as unprecedented. For example, a big one is so-called climate migration. There's a sense that anyone who lives on the coast, any coast, or anyone who lives in a wildfire-prone area, any wildfire-prone area, is going to have to move. And this is often described as a kind of unprecedented problem. But of course, humans moving around the landscape because of a changing climate is the oldest human story. It's the story, it's right out of Noah's flood. It's the story of peopling North America. And even in much more recent history, it's the story of, say, the Federal Resettlement Administration during the Dust Bowl and during the Great Depression broadly. So I'm sort of trying to retell the story of modern American history in light of the climate crisis, trying to bring to the fore moments and policy choices that didn't seem so important in the past that now seem newly relevant. Another example would be, we think, we're going to have to electrify everything. That seems really hard. Well, at the beginning of the 20th century, the United States had to electrify everything. So it doesn't mean that it would be easy, but at least it's not unprecedented. At least there's something in that vast storehouse of human history, or even modern American history, that can help give us maybe some footing as we try to face the future.
You write about, some issues and themes that are pretty contemporary or have some contemporary resonance. I didn't notice on your faculty website whether you are writing for more public or popular sites. It's looked like you were pretty academic focused. Is that something our guests often talk about, how much they're writing more popular piece, or the desire to maybe eventually write a trade press? Is that something you think about, or that has any appeal for you?
For better or for worse, I have one writer's voice. And, I can't, in my writing, I have never learned how to code switch, really. Maybe I'll put in or leave out the footnotes, but that's about as wide a range as I've got. And so, I'll write for anyone that is interested in that voice. It turns out that the New York Times likes that voice, so I've gotten to publish 7 or 8 essays in the Times. But that's the same writing that I do for Harvard University Press. It's the same writing I do if I write for the great kind of crossover journal Southern Cultures, where I just was the guest editor for a Katrina anniversary issue and wrote a new piece for them. It's the same voice I use when I've written for Rolling Stone. So, I don't think too much about it. Unburdens me because I can't do it, because I can't think about writing differently. It unburdens me from worrying too much about who I'm trying to write for. Sometimes if I'm feeling really ambitious, I'll try to think about who I would like to reach most with what I have to say. But for the most part, my writing is my writing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And because this is a writing podcast, we often really get into the weeds about it. And I know listeners like to hear about the variety of kind of writing and publishing experiences with that first book at Harvard. Did you find there was much editing, or did the experience of being published there, it's a great press?
Oh, I'll tell you. Yeah. I've got a story in praise of my editor here that I don't get to tell very much, but I'm glad that somebody might care, because it certainly changed my life. I had written a dissertation in graduate school about disasters in Louisiana, sort of the history of disasters in Louisiana, and certainly Katrina was on my mind. As I was saying, I sort of look at the present. I'm aware of writing from the perspective of the present, and to remember hearing from people as I hung out, I had moved to Louisiana. As I kind of hung out in Louisiana, people would say, rebuilding now after Katrina and then subsequent storms, Katrina and Rita, Ike, Gustav, there were a bunch of storms from 2005 to 2015. People would say, oh, it's much harder now than it used to be. So what do you mean? And just this idea that, again, these events that seemed singular actually were repeated again and again was provocative to me. I thought, oh, I could write a kind of, not a comparative history that would force me to generalize, different cases, but a kind of a history of one place, we were saying before, history of one place that had faced repeated environmental challenges under different political and social regimes. Struck me as a good dissertation topic. So I wrote this dissertation about the history of disasters in Louisiana, and it came time to sort of think about what it would mean to turn that into a book. And I brought it to a number of very good academic presses. And I was really gratified that they were excited about it. And they were, they were going to pay me dozens of dollars in advance. That's barely an exaggeration. But they were interested in it and genuinely so. And I'm really grateful to those editors. And then I brought it to this guy. Actually, he solicited a guy named Thomas Lebienne, who was a editor at Harvard at the time, who has since left. And he said something almost verbatim. I'm sure, Andy, that this dissertation has a lot of academic merit or whatever, but I'm not really interested in it. So he had me like 80% hooked just on the sort of basic, whatever that dating technique is, of feigning disinterest. But he said, you have a line in your book proposal that there's no definitive history of Katrina. And I think that you could write that book. I would be interested in that book. If you want to write it, it'd be a lot more work. And I knew what that line was about. I was in graduate school. I'd started writing my dissertation around 2010. And I just was sure that some big shot historian or other nonfiction author was going to come in and write a big history of Katrina that was going to be just blow me out of the water. That's an unfortunate pun, but just make me make my book irrelevant. And so I thought, oh, well, I have this one cool hack as a historian. I'll write about the past, and then I won't be subject to whatever big book comes out. By the time I was bringing the book proposal around, now it's like 2016 or so, that book had not been published. And I was also advanced enough in my career that I knew how to ask around. Is anyone writing a Katrina book? And there have been many Katrina books, many excellent Katrina books, but nothing like the one that I wanted to write. Nothing that felt like, and I think as I got more mature, I understood the point was not competition, but no one can write your book, but no one had answered my questions. No one had answered the questions that I had about Katrina. So when Thomas said, I think you could write this book, I sort of sat with that idea for a month or so and then thought, oh, I think I would like to try that. That seems like a much more important book, much more important set of things to know. And going back to how many books am I going to write? What do I want to know? Do I want to say that I know about the history of disasters in Louisiana, or do I want to say that I wrote a book about Katrina that answered a bunch of questions that really mattered to me? And that seemed like what I ought to do. So that was what made the book about Katrina. And Tom, what Thomas did for me, I wrote a manuscript. I think when I sent it in, it was around 350 pages long. And he went through and crossed out around 150 pages. And he crossed it out. When I say he crossed out 150 pages, the thing that was like really kind of arresting was that he would salvage 3 or 4 words on one of the pages. He would like cross out 10 pages in a row and then like circle half a clause. And it was arresting because, on the one hand, he's like, oh, this is an unnecessary chapter. You can sort of live with that. The idea that it's like there were only 7 salvageable words in that chapter was sort of much harder to deal with. As soon as I made his cuts, I was shocked by how much more I liked my own writing. Shocked. And I remember later people gave me the advice that, oh, it's a blessing actually that you had this 150 pages cut because you can publish those as articles. And I remember going to try to publish them and there was almost nothing there. Everything was like, 4 examples of something when one good one works, hedged bets, justifying language, stuff that was, I think, a product at first of my being insecure that I had to really prove my points with with a ton of evidence. More charitably, I would say it was me learning on the page, me convincing myself that something was true. And Thomas sort of taught me that I think, once the book's accepted by Harvard Press, that you only need to give one piece of evidence, and the reader will trust you enough. They don't need four to prove the same point. So that's all to say, I got incredible editorial guidance. He added one paragraph. He didn't change very much. He just went in there and cut until what was left was really strong. At least, yeah, in my opinion.
So you think the experience helped you kind of slim down your writing in general? I mean, most of us academics have way too much padding for the reasons you just said, that we're kind of taught to do that lawyerly qualifying sort of language. But did you find after that you were writing a little more succinctly?
Oh yeah, I now try to imitate my book voice. I learn, I haven't been lucky enough to have Thomas as an editor since then, but seeing what he did with my writing gave me something to aspire to, and sort of taught me, I think it just sort of, how to say it, it kind of gave me a reflection of the best version of myself as a writer, and being able to see that was really helpful. Yes, as I write now, and I am a much tighter writer now than I was before I saw his edits.
That's great. I read that before you even began work on your PhD, you were the founding director of the New Haven Oral History Project. I was just curious how that background, it seems like you were collecting voices and stories from the place where you grew up, how that's influenced your writing and storytelling.
It's influenced everything I do. It's hard to know what came first, the idea or the experience, but without getting into people are familiar with what oral history is, without getting to the history of the New Haven Oral History Project, what that experience did for me is it really shaped a view of history as one that is experienced by individuals. Even if you're writing about sort of capital H history, whatever, the rise of industrial capitalism, the class formation or whatever, these like sort of big tectonic forces in world historical life, they have to happen to individuals, I came to see, or they didn't really happen as ubiquitously as we thought. And so I just, from now whenever I approach a research question, I have to just kind of start with a set of characters who I want to get to know, who I want to have an empathetic relationship with, and just try to kind of imagine how they saw the world and why. And so, like when I was writing the Katrina book, not from my New Haven oral history example, I didn't even do that many oral history interviews for the Katrina book, but just the experience of doing oral history interviews led me to ask questions like, so I wanted to know, why did people live in these neighborhoods that flooded, was one of my key research questions. But to answer that question, I really had to come up with Lucille Duminy and Ida Bell Joshua and other people I could actually know, and I could ask, why did they live in the house that they lived in? And so I would research a set of individual people, and that was kind of my way in. And from that, I could, build a kind of more generalizable or theoretical analysis of American urban history, but always still narrated through the experience of those people. And I think it's also part of why being like I said before, a subfield historian has not been so appealing to me, because people don't experience their own lives in those segmented ways. They don't experience urban history as something distinct from environmental history, as something distinct from African American history. Ida Bell Joshua, who I write about, is a Black woman living in a post-World War II flood-prone suburb in Louisiana. And if I wanted to understand her life experience and also even just fundamentally, if I wanted to understand why she was living there, I couldn't be an urban historian and then an environmental historian, then an African American historian, then a women's historian. I had to just sort of be a historian of her and learn from all of those intellectual traditions to try to make sense of her situation. And I think all of that comes from my experience doing oral history. And the one other thing that oral history does, writing about living people, presenting their work back to them, it comes with, I think, a kind of ethical imperative to write in a voice that they can understand, because they become your most important peer reviewers. I don't think I'm not one who scolds people for using specific and precise language that is understood primarily by specialists. There's really important times and places for that. But I do think when you're writing, when you have imposed on someone for their time and had the sort of hubris to write about them that you do kind of owe them, the same way that your doctor owes you an explanation in terms that you can understand about your medical situation. Your historian owes you a description in terms that you can understand of your historical situation. And so that has always been kind of a tether to reality in terms of clear and, I've always been an E.B. White fan anyway, but clear and direct prose so that people can read it and say, Andy, I think that's wrong,
Speaking of, since you mentioned folks that you've interviewed might be kind of your peer reviewers in a way, is it your practice to show people you've interviewed what you've written about them before publication?
Oh, definitely. Who's going to, we were talking before about writing a book that would matter to people. It's not going to matter to anyone more than the people you wrote about. So that's my first audience. And of course, I'm not writing for them. It's not a vanity project in any way. So they are free to disagree with me. And one has to come to understand the difference between facts and analysis too. If someone tells you that they were not born in 1951, you better change it. If someone, if someone tells you that they don't think that that's why George W. Bush was elected, you can argue with them. And so, I don't, I'm not in the habit of changing what I write to please people. I am in the habit of asking them to fact check things that they are expert on. And also, depending on the circumstances, I'm quite sensitive to not wanting to share things, that they may have shared with me, not fully understanding how public it would be. So I'm pretty careful. It's never actually been a problem, but I just think ethically it's just important to have that step built into the process to say, if this goes really well, a lot of people will read this. Is that okay? Just to make sure that they have that opportunity. And usually people, even if they disagree with what you write, if you've written in good faith about them, they're usually pretty proud to be in a book or article or museum exhibit.
Yeah, I'm actually, I guess, sort of surprised to hear that it sounds like it's been a smooth experience. I think for a lot of our colleagues who are historians who write about earlier eras, this is one of the scariest parts of dealing with, live characters that are still around, and just imagining this interaction that you might have, because I don't know if I've ever been written about, but if somebody showed me something, that they had written about me, I'd probably just feel very self-conscious. I would imagine that some of your folks just would be sensitive to however they're being described.
I'm sure that's true. And, I don't really write, we could overstate this. I'm not writing profiles in a way that describe necessarily someone's bearing in the room. I'm not sitting as they have that, a emotional confrontation with their family member or something.
Right.
Which isn't, but I am, so, there's the sort of quibble. It's oh, am I really heavy set? Is that really the adjective we're using here? I don't have those moments. More, the kind of moments I have is to say, I think this is how it's experienced. You're really important. The history of your family, your family, your neighborhood, your community is something that deserves a smart person's serious attention and extended care. And that, I want to elevate it into the realm of history and hold it up so that people can try to learn about it and you and things that you've experienced. And most people, I think, are really proud to be a part of that.
I'm glad you said that. That is a great way to frame it, to explain it to people we might be interviewing. I'm also curious, since I'm guessing you have grad students, if this is, or students, or maybe younger folks in the field, is this writing about kind of local, writing about place, is this a good field for academics who might be listening and thinking this sounds pretty cool?
I just want to take a moment with your great switch of adjective there, where you said writing about local, I mean writing about place. It lets me retell it's not a joke really, it's a description of an old George Burns and Gracie Allen set piece where the couple is in Paris and George Burns really conspicuously orders a bottle of American wine. And Gracie says, "George, what are you doing? We're in France." And George says, no, everybody knows the best wine is always imported. One person's, it was always so funny to me when I was in graduate school and I'd be, applying for grants and fellowships to try to get to Louisiana. And when I got hired at Tulane, I knew that part of my pedigree, part of what stood out about my resume was my success at getting grants to travel to Louisiana, to write about Louisiana. And then when I got to Tulane, there were certain people who I will gladly name by email because, they should be ashamed of themselves, who would sort of look at what I did in a pejorative sense as local history, where, it was like, because just by virtue of being close, it was somehow less important. And I'm like, so, if I come from Yale to visit here, then it's important. But if I come from Tulane to visit here, it's less important. It was just so absurd. And we all know that this dynamic is repeated again and again in so many different ways that somehow local history is looked at as less than. So I'm not an apostle for, you should do the history of what's close to you. The thing that I don't know if it's the inverse, the obverse, whatever it is that you shouldn't think less of it just because it's close. I mean, that I think is the more important thing that I have to say, that, the extraordinary significance of the world right around you. I have all these dumb little aphorisms I keep. One is that, you can't claim that something's nationally significant if it didn't happen in your community. Because if it didn't happen in your community, then by definition, it wasn't national. It had to happen everywhere for it to be national. So that I think is the more important message that I try to get across. But certainly, if you're a graduate student trying to write a publishable paper or just a good research paper in a semester, or you are a scholar working on, with a limited travel budget or any of the kind of circumstances that might prevent you from traveling, especially if you do, U.S. history, it's just, why would you not write about the world right around you? The sources are there. And the audiences who are liable to care most about it are there too. And this just strikes me as like, one cool hack. Write about the community you live in.
Yeah.
It's always what I've done.
Right. I so agree. I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking, yeah, you do have that instant audience. Like, I am always interested in my place, so I'd be happy to read and hear someone talk about it. There are two questions that we ask all guests, and one is, what is something you wished you had known about writing or publishing earlier in your career?
That's a good question. I wish that I had more confidence in my writing process early on. I'm a very careful writer. One could use the word slow, but I would want to know what we're comparing that to. But it takes me a while to kind of get warmed up, and I'm easily compelled to go on little side quests. Is this the right word? Let's go to the Oxford English Dictionary, the 26 volumes of which are behind me right now in my office. I've just written about this. I've mentioned this event just as like a marker. I better go read a couple books about that event before I name drop it. One could call that procrastination, all of those things. But at the end of the day, I'm proud of my writing. And there's nothing really with my name on it that I wouldn't be proud to be known by. And I think that's because I put a lot of care into every sentence. It doesn't mean every sentence is good. I'm not saying that at all. I just mean that what I came to, I think, doubt as slowness or procrastination or there's kind of a stickiness with writing, I've come to think of is actually just patience. And rather than being insecure about it, I'm proud of it.
Yeah. I mean, this sounds very, I hear a lot of this sort of complaining or worrying about our slowness as academic writers. I'm just wondering, I didn't notice that it seemed like you were prolific when I looked at your bio, but as you said, maybe you're comparing yourself to those academics who we call machines. Has it been a problem that you're at the level of productivity you are, or is this purely an internal kind of critique that we all do, I think?
Let's see how much of the story I'm going to tell in this audience. When my wife was pregnant with our second daughter, we had to put a sticky note on the go bag for the hospital that said, send in the manuscript, because I could have fiddled with it forever. It was sort of, the book anyway was done for a while before I sent it in, because I just kept editing and changing things. So I think there was, I want to say, some domestic pressure for my book in particular to be done sooner. And sometimes I don't mess around with the deadline. If somebody says, I'm not slow on those terms, if the articles do X, it's going to be in on time. I take those things very seriously, but I often will, I'll cancel everything else to maximize the amount of time I have for writing. So yeah, slow compared to what, I don't know, but I think part of it, and it's one of the reasons why this program is so important, is that I think we don't have a good sense of how long things are supposed to take. We don't really know what to compare ourselves to. You can go, oh, you're supposed to write X number of words a day. Well, it's like, what kind of words are they good words or not?
Right. Yeah.
And so I think, some of that insecurity, I'm guessing for all of us, but certainly for me, comes from a just kind of absence of information, or comparing yourself, sure, to the people that have written 12 books since we started talking, but, comparing yourself to some hypothetical idea of what a writer is supposed to produce.
Yeah. Just to be concrete, do you have one of those kind of goals, or on writing days, are you someone who it's like this many hours or this many words, or just kind of a feeling of I've accomplished something?
My goal, and I want to say this truly with a great deal of humility, because I think I very rarely meet it, but my goal is always excellence, not a number of words. I would much rather write one sentence that I'm proud of than 100 that I'm not, because I'm going to delete the 100 I'm not anyway. Yeah. So I think what I mean when you asked me the further question was, what do I know now that I wish I knew then, is just to be able to say things like that and to feel good about them, that I'm pursuing excellence here. I'm pursuing quality, not quantity, that there's a snowball or like a snow cone place in New Orleans. And the slogan for 100 years has been, there are no shortcuts to quality. And I've adopted that motto from Hanson Snow Blues as my own, and to just feel proud that, like many of us, not better than anyone else, but like many of us, I'm a craftsman and this is my craft. And sometimes it takes some time to do it well. And the value proposition for academics in particular is not to write quickly. It's not to churn out a million different pieces of crap, a ton of widgets. It's to be an expert, to be thoughtful. We are a tiny group of people that society, for at least, one more generation, has set aside to be thoughtful and to do things on a somewhat different time scale. And I've gotten, more comfortable with the idea that is an important part of my job, is to be thoughtful. And you can't be thoughtful quickly.
Yeah. Thank you. Another question we ask is if there is a writing practice or habit that works for you.
Yeah. Self-loathing and crushing insecurity are the fuel for everything I do. I've found a way to transform all of these into positive statements over the past, few minutes, certainly. But really, I stare at the blank page and feel like a fool, and I write something and feel like I need to quit my job and should never try to write anything ever again. And then I write a paragraph and I think that will bring shame to every future generation, past and every previous and future generation of my family, should anyone ever know that it was possible for me to write this. And it takes a number of hours of that to kind of turn the coal into the diamond of the one sentence that I feel like could possibly be shared with another person for them to critique. And then I wait for them to tell me how bad it is. So that's a really important part of my process. Yeah, that's the honest truth, is just sitting around feeling very, very bad about what I'm doing until I start to feel good about it.
So that means it can mean working on a sentence or a paragraph for a very long time. Is that reading it aloud, coming back to it later? What gets you to the feeling better?
Yeah, I mean, I do all the things that, I guess if you bought, do they still sell like The Idiot's Guide to Writing or something? All the things.
Probably.
Read writers you admire, read writers who write differently, read this stuff out loud, take a walk, ask a friend to read it, compare it, like every single trick. I do all of them for every word I write.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of what I mean by, being so, like, I could phrase it positively as being careful and patient and thoughtful and ambitious. And I could phrase it negatively as being insecure and self-loathing and procrastinating and slow. And they're both true, both sides of that are true. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, the thing that I'm most patient with is I can, and this is probably just a kind of basic narcissism, but I can read my own writing again and again and again. And I'm willing and able to do that. And I'll read it out loud and make sure that it makes sense. I think, my number one goal is to be understood. And so I just really want to make sure that it makes sense. And I really want to make sure that I haven't I just want to be as clear as possible, because that's the goal, is like we have this privilege of having time and resources set aside for us to learn things. And our only goal is to figure them out and share them with others. And you can't fumble the ball on that last point. An imprecise sentence will mean that the reader's going to have an imprecise understanding. And so reading again and again and again to make sure that it makes sense I think, is a really important part of my process anyway.
Well, thank you for being so clear with us, Andy. This was a lot of fun. Thanks a lot.
Thanks again for having me, and thanks for this great program.
Thanks for listening to Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing, sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida. Visit our podcast description to find out how to contact us and send us your questions about academic writing and publishing. Follow us on social media at Writing It Pod and subscribe to us so you never miss an episode.